Hey guys, it's Kyle again, back with another episode of No Notes. Sorry I missed last Thursday. I just couldn't find any time on the road to film another episode, but I am back home for the weekend, and so I'm going to shoot both of the episodes for this upcoming week, because if this coming week is anything like the last one, then I suspect I'm probably not going to have any more time on the road to shoot. But if I do have time, I might shoot a bonus episode, so you might have that to look forward to. That being said, today's episode, this one's going to be coming out on Tuesday, is going to be somewhat short and sweet and to the point, which is out of the norm for me. But I want to talk about what happened last Tuesday in the mayoral election in New York City. So if you've been reading up on any of the news, then you'd know that a 33-year-old Muslim self-proclaimed socialist by the name of Zohran Mamdani has effectively won the New York Democratic mayoral primary. Now, he was running against ostensibly Andrew Cuomo, Brad Lander, and a few other candidates, and it was expected to be a rather close race between him and Andrew Cuomo. Well, as it turns out, somebody messed up somewhere, because really what was expected to be a very, very close race on election night ended up being a bit of a landslide. If I remember correctly, Zohran Mamdani was at an election night lead of about 7 points, maybe 8 points, doing a lot better in a lot of the demographics than people thought he was going to do. And ultimately, I think this points out to a couple of things. And a lot of people have been talking about, what this means for the future of the Democratic Party. And I'll tell you what it means. I think this is the clearest sign we've had so far that people want the establishment Democratic Party to go. Now let me explain. New York City is, for all intents and purposes, the establishment Democratic stronghold. You could make some argument that it might be San Francisco, where the Nancy Pelosi's and Kamala Harris's of the world hail from. You could make an argument that it might be Chicago. But I think the most resounding case could be made for New York City. Now, this is the city of the Tammany Hall political machine, which isn't as far in the past as you might think. If I'm remembering correctly, it was only about, 60 or 70 years ago that the Tammany Hall political machine, the structure of bribery and coercion to enshrine political power in the city was dissolved. And the remnants of that kind of politics and polity in that city is definitely still around. And you see that with mayors like Eric Adams. They've elected 2 Republican mayors, Mike Bloomberg and Rudy Giuliani, since 2000. And you have people like Bill de Blasio, which, while ostensibly somewhat progressive, certainly not the cookie cutter of an establishment Democrat, this is a city that has produced the likes of Hakeem Jeffries and Richie Torres and Chuck Schumer, who are the establishment. That's about as establishment, as corporate Democrat as you can possibly get. And that is for a couple of reasons. One, because of the remnants of that political machine that I was talking about before, and partly because it is the city that never sleeps. It's a city with hardworking people who are working around the clock. It's a population who is either extremely media literate or barely pays attention to media at all. And so what you have are people who are going solely off of name recognition or who they're seeing in TV advertisements, which is very establishment biased, or people who pay attention to a lot of media. And that's going to be things like the New York Times and the New Yorker and, the Washington Post and all of the TV news. And this is also a city where a lot of people do still watch TV news. And all of that TV news typically supports more corporate Democrats because, of course, all of these TV news agencies and even the likes of the Washington Post and New York Times are now very corporate enterprises. They are very pro-corporation. And so whether you are not paying attention to the media a lot at all and therefore are more susceptible to advertising and name recognition, or you are paying attention to a lot of media that is heavily corporatist and heavily corporate favored, you're going to be pushed towards the establishment. Now, the dynamic that's kind of changing in New York City that we saw play out in this last election was the fact that there's a lot more social media starting to creep into the media consumption habits of people in New York City. And I'm not sure of the exact demographics, but I know there are a lot of young people in New York City who have historically not really participated in elections. And what Zohran Mamdani found was that if he could find those young people, activate them, and get them to the polls, then he could stand a solid chance against these heavily corporate establishment Democrats. And we really saw that play out. And I think what the message the Democrats need to take from this is a mix of things, but I think the loudest and clearest message is that the establishment is not welcome. Now, I don't want to stretch this to say that progressive ideas are the only ideas that can win, and every single establishment idea is doomed for the trash heap of history, because I don't necessarily think that's true, or at least it's too much of a blanket statement for me to feel super comfortable backing it. Not every congressional district and not every state, not even every city in the US has the same demographic tendencies as New York City. And while I do think that progressive policies are more popular in more places than a lot of people like to think that they are, or would like to pretend that they are, you got things like 58% support for universal health care and 85% support for paid maternal leave and 70% support for paid paternal leave. Things like this are very popular policies that would even succeed in places like where I am in the now pretty heavily red Rust Belt. But nobody wants to run on them because they think, oh, the second you talk about those things, you become some kind of socialist. Well, we saw it play out in New York City. You had a lot of moderate voters who were not put off by a socialist label. In those moderate voters, and you can look in the voter demographics for Zohran Mamdani, he got a lot of middle-aged white support who are typically the more moderate and swayable voters, especially when you're talking about a race between a more establishment candidate and a more progressive anti-establishment one. Those are the people who are actually going to go back and forth between the status quo and something new. And this election, far and away, those people went for the more progressive, the new option. Now, again, this isn't to say that those exact policies that Zohran Mamdani was running on would work everywhere for the Democratic Party. And I do think there is a place for some slightly more moderate politics. Ultimately, I think a politician like Tim Ryan was exactly the right kind of candidate for the district that he represented at the time, which was a very working class Union Democrat district. And while he had some policies that were very progressive, he was eventually pro-legalization, very pro-choice. He warmed up to the idea of universal health care and ideas like this. He was more moderate in other areas in terms of like putting a lot of money into subsidies for manufacturing and supporting fracking still and things like this that are more necessary in areas like mine where a lot of people still rely on fracking jobs and manufacturing jobs. So, there's still room for that kind of stuff, but the takeaway is that people are sick of the Democratic Party as it sits today. whether you are more moderate or more progressive on the policy side of things, people want somebody who has energy, who has passion, who has a clear vision for what they want, and is clearly not beholden to corporate interests or the interests of the establishment Democratic Party. And I think that that is extremely important. Because for all intents and purposes, you had in this election Brad Lander, who was, I'm not going to say a more moderate candidate because he was still very progressive, but he was like a dialed down version of Zohran Mamdani. So if you were on board with Zohran Mamdani's policy ideas, but not on board with how anti-establishment and how rock the boat he was, if you were looking for a progressive policy agenda, but a more status quo style of politics, you had that in Brad Lander, and people showed up more for him than you might have thought, but he still didn't draw some huge demographic. And for the most part, anybody who was voting Brad Lander probably voted Zohran Mamdani second and vice versa because they cross-endorsed each other in their ranked choice voting system. So when we look at the results and the outcome of this election, I think that it is abundantly clear that people just wanted a new style of politics. They're sick of all of this focus group, poll-tested workshop gobbledygook that just has stopped sounding like normal people. And say what you want about Zohran Mamdani's affluent or relatively affluent upbringing, he definitely sounded like a just normal person. And he had these campaign ads out there aimed at young people and going through different languages of the different constituencies he was seeking to win, and going through and just being himself and being unashamedly him. And we see that that is a very winning formula. In the super, super fake, veneered establishment Democrats like Hakeem Jeffries, like Chuck Schumer, I think need to be taking the message that their kind of politics isn't welcome anymore. Now, is there a world where those people, quote unquote, peel off the veneer? Sure, but I think those people are too far down that path to really change all that much. And if they're not careful and they refuse to read what's written in the cards here, they could very, very, very quickly find themselves kicked out of the party that they are currently ostensibly leading. Now, to expand this a little bit, I think this points to a very positive trend for somebody like, if you're Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, this bodes very well for you, especially considering that you endorsed Zohran Mamdani in New York City. Your style of politics is clearly winning and more popular than anybody seems to have thought that it was. People thought that, election night was going to be like in the mid 30% range for both Mamdani and Cuomo, and there was going to be no clear winner on election night, and we were going to have to wait until today, when this video comes out on Tuesday, to get the ranked choice tabulations to see who actually won. And the victory for Zohran Mamdani was so drastic on election night that even though Zohran Mamdani didn't achieve the 50% vote threshold to officially win the election, Andrew Cuomo still decided to concede essentially on election night and, do the whole, I called him to congratulate him on his great campaign and his excellent win on election night. And that was no small feat. We're talking about a 7 to 8% lead for Zohran Mamdani that made that the reality for Andrew Cuomo on election night. And so when we're looking at those kinds of margins in a city where the establishment has more money, more of a hold on the media apparatus, more of a hold on the advertising apparatus than in basically anywhere else in the country. If a progressive can have the ground game, the volunteer network, the support, the social media presence required to win in that kind of place, then I think that anywhere in the country, even in a district like mine, which is Republican by 15 or 16 points, could probably see some success with progressive candidates. because I do genuinely think, I genuinely believe that there is real crossover between Donald Trump voters and voters for somebody like Zohran Mamdani. We saw it in the 2024 election when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez went through her constituency and she found a considerable number of people who voted for both her and Trump. And the sole item, the one item on their agenda was, what is in power now is not working for me. It is an anti-establishment, anti-status quo kind of mindset. And when you come to middle America and you talk to workers, a lot of them voted for Trump not because they love his immigration policy or because they love his economic policy or because they love something else about his own policy agenda. They voted for him because the system that was in place was not working for them. They just went through 4 years of Joe Biden where they were talking all the time about how our economy is getting better, we're creating so many jobs, and we're funding so much infrastructure. And your average worker saw nothing from that. Their consumer prices largely didn't change. Cars didn't get any cheaper. Homes didn't get any cheaper. Their wages didn't go up enough to keep up with inflation. And so they looked at 4 years of a Democratic presidency that, even though admittedly more progressive than any presidency we've had since maybe LBJ or even maybe FDR, it still wasn't near enough to actually improve those people's lives. And if you don't improve their lives, then they're going to assume it's a problem with the system as is. And I'm inclined to believe them in that aspect. So while I still think their decision to vote for Donald Trump was misguided and misinformed, and that Donald Trump fooled a lot of those people, and some of you, I hope, or maybe even watching this video, I 100% completely understand where that vote was coming from. And I'm not going to sit here and belittle you for taking that vote, because even though some people are sitting there saying back to back to back to back that, oh, you're voting against your own personal interests, it's hard to make that judgment when there was not a vote you could have made that was for your personal interests. I don't think a Kamala Harris presidency for, it probably would have been less harmful than this presidency, no doubt, but I don't think it would have been any more beneficial for that many people. It would have been probably more of the same: corporate subsidies, job creation, maybe bring back some manufacturing jobs, but it probably wouldn't have managed to make a dent in the minimum wage. It probably would have done almost nothing to provide more people health care. It probably would have done little to nothing to save Social Security. Probably would have done little to nothing to alleviate a lot of the pressures that people on food stamps, Medicaid, and Medicare find themselves under. When you look at an establishment that so consistently fails to deliver on their promises, it's hard to blame those people for going, we just want something different. The guy who walks up on stage, or girl for all that's worth, who walks up on stage and says that they are going to change things, is going to get their vote. And when you have Kamala Harris coming out and saying like, oh, I wouldn't have done anything differently if I were president for the last 4 years, and that I'm totally in sync with the Biden agenda, it was unappealing to people who thought that the Biden agenda hadn't done anything for them, no matter how misguided or founded in reality that belief was. Because for a lot of people, that administration didn't do anything for them. Looking at this mayoral race, I think it is a cut and dry, clear-cut example for the Democratic Party writ large and politics writ large that people don't think the system is working for them. And that includes the current one, the current Republican system that is currently in power. People don't think that it's working. People don't feel like it's improving their lives. And that's especially more true the farther and farther left you go. I think that when we're looking at what went wrong in 2016 and what went wrong in 2024, we have to look at that group of voters who, that there was a group of voters who overlapped between voting Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary and then voting for Donald Trump in both 2016 and 2020. And those kinds of people are the people that Zohran Mamdani brings back into the fold. And, I really don't care if you want to say that, oh, those people aren't welcome here. Anybody who voted for Donald Trump is terrible, because ultimately that kind of attitude does not win you elections. And having that kind of animosity towards people for a political choice that could have been as simple as, well, my life hasn't gotten any better over the last 4 years. No other information. And that voter very much exists. I don't think it's fair to look at that person and try to tell them that they made the wrong choice, or that they were irrational, or that they weren't thinking in their own best interest. Because I think they were just working with a very small set of information. As we look forward in politics, in both the Republican and the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party especially, we need to put forward candidates who are anti-establishment, who are pro-change, who bring new policies and a clear vision to the fore. Whether that is a progressive policy agenda of universal health care or not, people want energy, they want passion, they want vision, they want anti-establishment. We need to get people with energy, with passion, normal everyday people from factory floors and, machine shops and doctors, nurses, EMTs. All these people need to be thinking to themselves, is there a place for me in politics? Because we are going into a new era where a politics that is not innately political, that is putting people first and workers first and quality of life first and affordability first over how beholden they are to some corporate interest that gave them tens, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of dollars, is going to be the real winner. That is going to be the winning politics of tomorrow. Mark my words. Whether it's somebody like AOC or even a successor to somebody like Donald Trump, the winner of the next election will be somebody who, at least rhetorically, puts the ideas of workers, people, and improving their lives first. And when you pull out these policies that are like, oh, limited subsidies for small groups of people, or we're going to give a bunch of money to corporations to build a bunch of stuff, without any mind for, permanent job creation, raising wages, improving quality of life for workers writ large, those are going to be losing ideas. People aren't going to be drawn to the polls to vote for those kinds of things. And that kind of politics that is represented by Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and the moderated approach is done for. No longer is that politics going to hold any kind of sway among people, or to the extent that it does hold sway among people, it will not hold enough sway to have any kind of power in modern politics. In the era of social media, a lot more peer-to-peer direct discussion about politics, in an increasingly more muddied media environment, that kind of people politics is going to take us into the political world of tomorrow. So that's it for Tuesday's episode of No Notes. If you liked it, go ahead and leave a comment below, like, and subscribe. If you want to see more, I have a couple more episodes of this. You can go back and watch that I think are still relevant now, even though some things have changed. And I will see you again on Thursday. Peace.